The Fuji GW690ii, for when you plan on posting your selfie on the screen of an IMAX theater, but want the rangefinder style. The OG 690 was released in Japan November 1978, while this was released in June of 1985. It's worth noting there is also a GX670 released a month later, and the GW690ii was released in February of 1992. There is even a 680, but that has a bellow system and is more like a Mamiya RB and RZ camera. Nobody needs a medium format camera, and it's hard to make the case over full frame digital these days, but with a frame this large, the case is a bit easier to make. The frame of a 6x9 medium format is approximately 5 times the size of a 35mm frame. Most people will be using 120, and that gives you 8 shots per roll, which means a single roll of Cinestill 50 daylight roll at $14 costs $1.75 for every click of the shutter. The good and bad news? It's fully manual. No exposure assistance or anything. And if you mess up, you will pay for it. Literally. You know how some tribes don't like their picture taken because they think it takes their soul? Well, this camera might actually do it. The film loading bay could in fact double as a ghost trap. Let's get the 35mm equivalent stuff out of the way real quick. The GW690ii has a 90mm lens with the fastest aperture of f3.5. This is the 35mm equivalent of a 38mm lens with an f-stop of 1.5. While that might sound insanely fast, keep this in mind. When converting this lens to the 35mm equivalent, you don't get the same distortion as a normal 38mm might, and while that aperture sounds quick at f1.5, you really only get the benefit of same depth of field, this being about 0.6 feet at 6 feet from the subject. But you're only still letting in about an f3.5 amount of light. Keep that in mind for exposure. Sort of the same thing for the GSW690ii. Its 65mm lens opens at f5.6. This is the equivalent of a 28mm lens at f2.4. So be prepared to use a tripod for slower shutter speeds, using very high ISO speed film, or just always shoot with enough light. This lens is very good, but at this format, when you don't nail a focus, it lets you know. I would expect to pay anywhere from $400 to $800 US for the Gen 2s, and maybe a little more for the Gen 3s. This camera weighs in at 3.2 pounds or 1,475 grams. I wouldn't call this heavy, but due to its size, you would think it'd be heavier. This thing at launch also cost $1,476 in 1985 or $3,517 in today's money. That's like buying a Canon 5DS or a Sony A9, but you get a lens with this. And this camera isn't all plastic, although it might look like it. There's a frame counter, but I feel like judging this sort of thing is like judging high miles on a car. I think it depends more on what the car was doing while getting most of those miles and how it was taken care of. The Gen 2 brought with it a hot shoe instead of the accessory shoe, and straps are now on both sides. It's gripped instead of ribbed for your pleasure. I use this for when I'm feeling a little Gregory Crutzen-ish or Sally Mannish. I like to think of this as my portable large format camera. Not that they're a good facsimile or even gives the same results. God bless you large format photographers, but I'm not lugging around those and taking one frame at a time. My GX617 is the closest I'll go. This camera is insane in its concept. A 6x9 medium format rangefinder. I don't know who in the marketing department came up with this, but thanks. Probably the same mindset as the person who wanted to make a 50 cal handgun. Both were products of the 80s, and we know what was big in the 80s if you know what I mean, and I think you do.